Welcome back to Drunk on Writing and the first of 4 special Stephen King dissection addendums, brought to you in part through the patronage of Arya North and David, where we're taking a deep dive analysis into King's originally 1978 novel, The Stand. A suggestion from Drunk on Writing patron, the Cinephiliac, and a great one at that because, well, throughout the now years of the COVID-19 pandemic, The Stand happened to be brought up quite a lot for clearly obvious reasons, but also because it was recently adapted into a miniseries for the CBS All Access, nay, Paramount Plus streaming service. An adaptation I've yet to see, but which we'll soon be dissecting in earnest. Rather looking forward to that one, even given what I've heard about it. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on The Stand's previous adaptations, as well as my previous thoughts on the novel at large, be sure to check out the original Drunk on Writing dissection of The Stand. I sing in like the first 30 seconds of that one, so it's worth it probably just for that. I will not be singing in this episode, I will tell you that, because today our focus is on just one section of the novel. Book 1, Captain Trips, along with its prologue and the events of June 13th through July 4th, 1990. That is from the accidental release of Project Blue, also known as the titular Captain Trips, and just a rather nasty virus. Two of our main protagonists meet cute-ish, somewhere around there. But before we get to all of that, if you enjoy this episode, please give it a like, share it with a friend, follow the channel, and consider heading on over to drunkonwriting.com, where you can get more videos more often and, help shape the content like the Cinephiliac has done here. Now, I have to tell you, if you haven't read The Stand in the last few years, it's a trip, to put it mildly, particularly this first section following Project Blue. In a post-COVID world, well, in a post-knowing COVID world anyway, everything about Project Blue, from the government's response to the mass confusion and hysteria to the violence and rioting, hits home in a way it never did before, even though this is a pretty difficult part of the book to get through. Thankfully, though, Stephen King's novel is a bit of an exaggeration compared to what we've truly experienced with COVID. After all, The Stand's Project Blue has a 99.4% communicability rate, meaning almost everyone who comes into contact with it gets infected, and everyone who gets infected dies. Everyone. Compare that to COVID-19, which, while you can surely catch it even with masks, even vaccinated, has a 98% survivability rate. Most people recover. I had it. It sucked. It sucked a lot. But I'm still here. And I take comfort in knowing it could have been so much worse. Now, I mentioned masks there. And I will say that's one huge difference between this book and reality. There's not one mention in The Stand of the public wearing masks. Some may look at that with hindsight as something of an oversight on King's part, but I believe their exclusion here is more a function of time than anything else. Keep in mind, the entirety of The Stand's Book 1, which basically ends with most of the world dead or dying, takes place over the course of just 2.5 weeks. That'd be like all of our pandemic, the entirety of our pandemic, all these years just kind of smashed up and dumped into January 2020. Now, just for the record, mask guidance wasn't issued by the CDC until months later, months after January 2020. So, food for thought. But while the timeline is relatively slim in this book, at least in this part of the book, in these couple of weeks, the virus wreaks absolute havoc across the fictional U.S. So much so, in fact, in so many places to so many people that I think in order to really properly steer our discussion today, to really analyze what happens and how it reflects what we've gone through, I think we'll benefit from something that Stephen King himself thought rather prudent. I think we need to borrow from J.R.R. Tolkien. I think we need a map. The Stand, along with its fictional pandemic, begins somewhere in the Western California desert where, as I said earlier, Project Blue is accidentally released at an undisclosed underground bunker between shifts in the early morning hours of June 13th, 1990. If not for what seems to be a computer glitch on top of that accident, this epic novel would have ended there and made for quite the short story, I'm sure, given the various states we find the scientists within this bunker. Some seem to have died almost immediately, while others had time to panic, among other things. But aside from a rather eerie aftermath, which also made for an unforgettable intro to the original TV miniseries, we don't get that story. Because with The Stand, King is more focused on the larger picture, despite his breadth of sometimes questionable detail. So, alas, the only explanation we have in terms of cause is that somebody made a mistake. And though the facility was designed to lock down immediately, it doesn't. Why? An I wasn't dotted, a T not crossed. Someone used a semicolon instead of a period. Who knows? I don't know. I don't even know if Stephen King knows. He probably just was like, made a mistake. Though it is eventually sealed. This whole facility does end up sealed, just not before security guard Charlie Campion is able to whisk his family away to seeming safety around 2:15. The infected Charlie Campion. No, they are very much not safe. Not safe at all. Now, a not so obvious detail here that I actually only caught while writing this dissection, it's one of the primary reasons I love doing them, discovering these nuances, was also a touch of delicious irony on King's part, even though I'm not exactly certain it was on purpose. Thanks to Project Blue, you could look at June 13th, the day that Project Blue gets out, as the metaphorical end to America's so-called party. The good times, even if no one knew it yet. The before times, which is a real phrase I've heard tossed around in reference to life before COVID. My son says that quite often. But June the 13th is also the day our strung-up protagonist, Larry Underwood, following an intervention from his good old buddy Wayne Stuckey, calls his real, actual house party to a close. So while the Project Blue carrying Campion is skedaddling out of California, Larry's doing the exact same, leaving LA for New York to avoid a few not so nice guys he owes quite a bit of money to. We'll come back to Larry in just a moment. By the night of June 16th, having passed through Nevada and Salt Lake City and presumably on the way to Mexico, Campion and his family reached the fictional town of Arnett, Texas, which is, unfortunately, as far as they get. Well, as far as Campion gets, at the very least. The rest of his family is, at this point, bloated and dead and rotting in the car. And I'm not even sure I should say Campion really makes it, given he crashes into a Texaco and, in doing so, makes Arnett, Texas, the pandemic's flashpoint. Campion infects Bill Hapscomb, aka Hap, owner of that Texaco, along with several of his regulars, including our chief protagonist, the man of few words, Stu Redman, as well as 3 medics who tend to the victims. He likely infects even more once he reaches the hospital in the also fictional Braintree, where he dies about 10 after 9, giving us a Project Blue timeline, 3 days, roughly, from exposure to death. Maximum. The Braintree coroner, man, I could just imagine the fear that crept up that coroner's spine. Calls in a few pathologists to look Campion over, and by 8 in the morning, June 17th now, they call the plague center in Atlanta, Probably a phone call they never wanted to make, thought they would have to make, but one that's certainly merited given by 10:15, so just 15 hours or so after the crash. Hap and his regulars, they're not feeling so great. Norm Brewitt's woken with a horrible cold and unknowingly infected his entire family. His wife's gone on and infected the family she's babysitting. Hap's passed Project Blue on his state trooper cousin Joe Bob, who, over the next few days, passes Project Blue on to more than 40 others, including insurance salesman Harry Trent, who we'll touch on again in just a moment, potentially infecting half of East Texas, and perhaps further. King aptly refers to this as a lethal chain letter, one that actually works. Remember chain letters? They were fun. Joe Bob isn't picked up until June 18th, the same day Vic Hammer, head of Project Blue, so probably dealing with quite a lot at this point, the same day he commits suicide, leaving his father-in-law, career soldier Bill Starkey, as our new man in charge. We'll come back to him also. But the rest, basically everyone that's assumed infected, and boy are they not well, are escorted out of Arnett on the afternoon of June 17th, and taken via plane and an expendable military crew to Atlanta, while their hometown of Arnett is put into the barbed wire perimeter level of quarantine. By June 19th, all of the regulars are falling like dominoes. All except for Stu, that is, who, for reasons unknown, is feeling great. Worried, stressed, afraid, sure, but physically, great. And no one can figure out why. It's the best part. Meanwhile, over in East Texas, that insurance salesman I mentioned, Harry, he stops for lunch, infecting a New York police detective on his way home, along with his family, who stay the night in Oklahoma, infecting more families bound for West Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee. They also visit a doctor's office in Kansas the next day, where they infect still more, who infect still more. By nightfall, Project Blue's made itself known as far as Arkansas, where, just outside the fictional Shoyo, our wandering mute hero Nick is beaten and left for dead by a couple of local yokel, just bad people. But he's picked up, and more importantly, patched up by the town sheriff, John Baker, who is, unfortunately, as he puts it, coming down with a nasty cold. One that night, leads to the worst fever he's had since he was a kid. By June 20th, it seems likely Project Blues traveled all the way up to Algonquin, Maine, where 21-year-old Franny Goldsmith, who's just found out she is pregnant, is, relatively safe and sound. Although the baby daddy she won't marry kind of sucks, and she's got some problems to sort out with her parents, particularly her still grieving her dead son mother, who, potentially weakened from finding out about the pregnancy, or potentially just from inhaling the wrong air at the wrong time, has fallen ill. While that could possibly not yet be Project Blue, by June 20th, the virus has without a doubt made it to New York City, as evidenced by background theater coughing, while Larry, who reached his mother's doorstep around 4 a.m. the day before, watches one of the Nightmares on Elm Street. I assume The Dream Child, which released in the summer of 1989, and while that's maybe thematically on the level, it would have been amazing to me if it were 1991's Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Doesn't that just seem so much more appropriate? Back in Shoyo, after taking down those good-for-nothing yokels, the sheriff is so beat down by Project Blue, he has to deputize Nick so he can look after the prisoners until the state troopers come the next day. Unfortunately, it's clear by the next morning, June 21st, by which point most of the town is sick, including the local physician, Dr. Soames, that the state troopers won't be coming. Not that day. Not ever. In Atlanta, 3 days into his stay now, Stu starts to get himself some answers, though perhaps not the ones he was hoping for. Keeping to that timeline of ours, almost everyone he came to the plague center with has died. And That night, while Stu dreams of fields of corn, of an acoustic guitar, and of two burning red eyes, a nurse in this seemingly locked down facility, starts sneezing. Which brings us to June 22nd. In Shoyo, Sheriff Baker dies around 2 in the morning. In New York, Larry's mother Alice calls out of work after fighting a cold for the last couple of days. In Ogunquit, Franny's mother's in bed with, despite the earlier nebulous possibilities, a particularly nasty breed of flu. In LA, Wayne Stuckey, he of Larry's party pooping committee, is losing his fight with Captain Trips. Not that Larry seems to really care all that much. In fact, he mostly dismisses any concern about Project Blue whatsoever. Until that afternoon, anyway, when he finds his mother hallucinating and practically on fire with fever. It takes hours, but Larry eventually gets her into an ambulance with 5 others. Back at Shoyo, with more and more bodies piling up as the day wears on, the ailing Dr. Soames, well, he's a smart guy. 9 days out from Blue's accidental release, he manages to put 2 and 2 together. Somebody made a mistake, he says, and they're trying to cover it up. How does he know this? What does he know that other people can't? Well, for one, he's noticed that the phones have all stopped working. The highway is barred off, and so is every road leaving town. Of course, the news of something like this will get out. Dr. Soames warns us with what turns out to be one of his final lines. And it won't take long. And in the meantime, how many will die? Well, as of June 23rd, the same day Stu's relocated to Stovington, Vermont, while the Atlanta Plague Center gets the chance to do some first-hand research, news is indeed starting to hit the air. Reports of Army personnel in Arkansas, of an East Coast flu epidemic caused by the so-called Russian strain. But, as the newscasters point out, it's nothing to really worry about.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Enter one, Bill Starkey, the keeper of secrets, the man in charge. Already behind the soldiers, behind the newscasters, and the reason they're spoon-feeding lies to the public at this point, with one code word, Troy. Starkey enacts a policy that helps to ensure the news goes nowhere for as long as humanly possible, even if it takes putting some bullets into faces. Turns out as long as possible is basically just a day or two thanks to the lethality and rapid spread of Project Blue, but imagine for us, bear with me here, imagine for us with how slow COVID is to show outward symptoms, to show any symptoms. Imagine how effective a suppression policy could be in the short term. Maybe in fact we don't need to imagine. It wasn't until the end of December 2019 that the viral pneumonia outbreak at the Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan, China made headlines across the world, including here in the US, our first taste of the eventual COVID pandemic. However, those weren't the first mysterious cases of pneumonia in the area at that time. On November 13th, 2019, the New York Times published an article referencing 2 people reportedly from sparsely populated Inner Mongolia who had a fever and complained of breathing difficulties before seeking treatment in Beijing and subsequently being diagnosed with pneumonic plague. Except, this was a weird case, as a doctor at Beijing Shaoyang Hospital, Li Jiefeng, wrote in a long since deleted social media post. After so many years of specialist training, I'm familiar with the diagnosis and treatment of most respiratory diseases, Li wrote. But this time I looked and looked at it. I couldn't guess what pathogen caused this pneumonia. I only knew it was rare. Chinese censors acted swiftly, instructing news aggregators to block and control online discussion related to news of a potential plague outbreak. Perhaps the censorship reached even further, given, as the Times wrote in their article, Dr. Li could not be reached for comment and Beijing Chaoyang Hospital declined to comment. In a November 16th op-ed for Foreign Policy, columnist Laurie Garrett provided a bit more background on why this response was particularly worrisome. China's National Health Commission has assured the World Health Organization, according to an agency spokesperson, that a robust effort is underway to find and monitor all individuals who have been in contact with the Beijing couple, both in Inner Mongolia and during their travel to Beijing. But given the Chinese government's public health history, covering up the 2003 SARS epidemic even as it traveled to 30 other nations, denying the spread of the dangerous H5N1 influenza in the country for years, and stifling social media accounts of outbreaks, a fair amount of caution and skepticism is merited, especially given how effective their block and control tactic seems to have been. During the month of November 2019, for instance, there are hundreds of articles from and about Wuhan, China. But in December 2019, there were only 10 articles. Yes, 10. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it from my own two eyes. 6 of which all dropped at the end of the month alongside that outbreak announcement. And none of which referenced those earlier mysterious cases from Inner Mongolia. Even after a 2021 study on COVID's origins from the University of California showed mid-October 2019 as the earliest it could have been spreading, pretty in line with our patient zeros who initially sought treatment on November 3rd. But maybe they truly are unrelated. After all, at the same time those sensors kicked into gear, please also quarantine 447 people in Beijing and 46 in Inner Mongolia to help control a potential outbreak. They were all released by November 21st, after which, there was no outbreak. As far as I know of, anyway. But, and this is the big but here, this is the thing that got me really thinking. If you were a doctor in Beijing dealing with an unknown pneumonia-causing pathogen, what would you do with it? I think chances are you do exactly what that Braintree coroner did in the stand. You'd call the experts, perhaps those at an Institute of Virology. You know where one of those is located in central China? Yeah, Wuhan, the seeming epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak, the Arnett, Texas of our tale, if you would. Could an infected Wuhan Institute of Virology researcher have accidentally exposed others at the Huanan market? Probably not, actually, given the market's more than 8 miles away. But do you know what's within easy walking distance from the market? A branch office of the Wuhan CDC. Could an infected researcher from the Wuhan CDC have accidentally exposed others? I mean, given it's happened before, 2 researchers were independently infected with SARS at a lab in Beijing in 2004, unknowingly passing it on to 7 others before the outbreak was contained? Yeah. Yes. Absolutely, yes. There has been much talk of COVID potentially originating in a Wuhan lab, but honestly, I really don't think it started there. I mean, looking at the stand, where was Project Blue? It was not in Arnett, Texas. It was in the empty California desert. Then it migrated. You know what sounds a lot like an empty desert to me? Sparsely populated Inner Mongolia. And did you know that area, and this is true, this is 100% true, also houses China's largest military training ground? It does. The Zhuhai Combined Tactics Training Base, which covers more than 1,000 square kilometers and where numerous war games are played out, including exercises focused on nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare. And when you compare a map of the earliest pneumonic plague cases as provided by China CDC Weekly, and which also includes a 3rd case diagnosed as bubonic plague, against where the Zhuhai base is located, well, it doesn't take a very active imagination to figure maybe someone right there, forgot to dot an I, missed that one T, slipped in that semicolon instead of a period. And if we follow that line of logic, what are the chances a Starkey was brought in to call the shots? Could someone whose task it was to keep this quiet succeed in doing so for nearly 6 weeks? Is that possible? I mean, I've seen a lot of impossible in my short time on this earth, and to be honest, I really don't care if someone did, or even if COVID was truly developed in a lab. None of that would surprise me or matter to me. What matters to me is what comes next. While this is where our timelines drastically differ, or at the very least, given the slow burn, restlessness, unease, economic collapse, and admittedly worsening acts of violence we've seen over the last few years, perhaps it's simply the speed of our timeline that differs, The Stand provides one potential outcome: the end of humanity as we know it. Though, if I'm following King's timeline right, we're still, let's call it 2 days early, because June 1990 still holds some rather awful cards up its sleeves, including interstate fugitives. Starting out of Las Vegas, former jailbirds Polk and Lloyd leave a trail of bodies across Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, where the spree ends in a mugging gone bad and Polk pokerized, aka very violently dead. Lloyd, though, he lives, for now, and is detained at the Apache County Jail. We'll come back to him, just like we've done all of the others, but elsewhere. In Shoyo, one of Nick's attackers, Vince Hogan, dies in his cell during the night. Another, Billy Warner, dies the next morning, June 24th, after which Nick lets his final attacker, at least of those caught, Mike Childress, who's sick anyway, go free. In Stovington, shortly past noon, they remove Stu's TV. No more news for him. In New York, Larry's mother dies in the overcrowded halls of Mercy Hospital. In Arizona, Lloyd, told you we'd get back to him, has been transferred to the Phoenix Municipal Jail, where the guards have runny noses and where he's being fast-tracked toward the death penalty. In Ogunquit, a town meeting is called, during which they decide to close off the borders of the town at midnight. And somewhere in the mysterious California desert, less than a mile out from Project Blue's origins, though there's no particular reason given, Bill Starkey is relieved of duty. Is it possibly because of that code word Troy? No, I don't think so. In fact, I think it's simply because he failed on all counts. He failed to contain Project Blue, which has now also appeared in Oregon, Nebraska, Louisiana, and Florida, with potential cases also in Mexico and Chile. He failed to contain it, he failed to keep it out of the news, and he failed to protect America. He failed. And so he has to go. But before he does, our man in charge has one final order to give, with one code phrase: Rome falls. Starkey ensures Project Blue's lab origins remain a secret, or, at the very least, a wild theory, thanks in part to sleeper cells in the USSR, China, and more, who, not accidentally, release samples of the virus into the wild. Starkey then walks into the Project Blue facility and shoots himself. As King would write somewhere else in this tome, no great loss. That night, the superflu epidemic finally hits the news proper, with headlines on serious outbreaks in New York, San Francisco, LA, and London. Though the notably nervous reporters, almost as if somebody's watching them, state that a vaccine has been developed. However, the news doesn't include any film clips, which is just not really how the news works. So you just gotta know things are actually pretty bad out there. And before the night comes to a close, somewhere in Idaho, on his way toward Nevada, Randall Flagg, the walking dude, perhaps our new man in charge, realizes he can do magic again. Dun dun dun! Outside of Ogunquit by the morning of June 25th, several travelers have already been shot. But by nightfall, most of those standing guard will have fallen ill or died themselves. And in Shoyo, Jane Baker, Sheriff Baker's wife, dies with Nick looking over her. And that's mostly it for June 25th, a relatively calm day in the grand scheme of things. And you know what they say about the calm before, right? Because this brings us to June 26th, exactly 13 days after Project Blue's release. The day the shit hits the absolute fan. In Kentucky, posters detailing Project Blue are plastered overnight across the University of Louisville. In Boston at 9:01 a.m., newscasters and technicians capture the WBZ TV broadcasting station where they'd been under armed guard for a week. Taking the opportunity, they broadcast those seemingly missing film clips for what's left of their viewers, including footage of Boston General Hospital overrun with the sick and dying, of a truck releasing a cascade of bodies onto a barge, and much, much more. A lot of really gruesome stuff. The entire group is summarily executed on charges of treason. In West Virginia, a local newspaper releases a special extra edition about the plague, informed by a major who'd been assigned to Project Blue. It includes a warning that there is no vaccine and that Project Blue was created by the U.S. government. Unfortunately, no one is alive or well enough to read it. In LA, the Times attempts to release similar information, but the presses are dynamited, killing 28, and by 7 that night, LA, the entire city, is up in flames. In Springfield, Missouri, on KLFT's morning phone-in show, Ray Flowers opens the lines to discuss the superflu. He lasts till almost noon, at which point a 20-man patrol opens fire on his broadcast booth. His last words are, "I think they're going to shoot me." In Boulder, Colorado, a rumor that the U.S. Meteorological Air Testing Center is really studying biological warfare causes a mass exodus, and the center's destruction via plastique later in the day. In Phoenix, Lloyd meets with his lawyer, who now has a runny nose, for what turns out to be the last time. But he does have good news. It seems Lloyd is going to get a postponement on his trial because everyone is sick. In Ohio, 2,000 Kent State University students take to the streets after being quarantined to campus since June 22nd. U.S. Army soldiers, led by Colonel Albert Phillips, maintain the quarantine with machine guns, until they, perhaps inevitably, turn those guns on each other. In Des Moines, Iowa, a fire and ensuing riot guts most of the downtown area. In Ogunquit, Franny's father dies at 8:30 in his bed. To console herself, Franny watches what she thinks is an in poor taste drama, but which is, in actuality, 62 public executions performed live on TV. Murders that only cease when the army forces their way into the studio. And finally, that night, from an undisclosed location, the president delivers an address riddled with coughs, denying rumors that the flu is fatal and that it was bred for military use. He also notes that there are confirmed outbreaks in both Russia and China. Rome has fallen. And from here on out in the stand, though there are some lingerers, we're basically post-Project Blue, post-America, at least as far as we know. I mean, with that 99.4% communicability, we're talking less than 1.5 million people left alive across the entire United States. That's less people living in Manhattan today. But even for the survivors, Blue's not quite over, and its effects are probably far more reaching than anybody would have anticipated right from the start, and rather extremely varied in their misery. From electricity going out coast to coast to starved and starving Central Park Zoo animals in New York, along with dead monster shouters, to starved and starving prisoners in Phoenix. Poor Lloyd has quite the spread tiding him over. Rats and cockroaches and his neighbor Trask. Down in Shoyo, Nick's almost killed again by the same exact guy that nearly beat him to death originally, while up in Stonington, Stu has quite the time escaping what's become a nightmare of a dead facility. The repercussions that truly show just how horrible the situation has become, though, are those that don't affect our ragtag group of drifters and loners. The ones King dedicates an entire chapter to. The ones that make up the so-called second epidemic, which he also nicknames those old emergency room blues. A combination of being unable to cope and being unable to function. Like in Murfreesboro, Georgia, where orphan 5-year-old Sam Tauber falls into a well and breaks both his legs, eventually dying from a combination of shock, hunger, and dehydration. In Lodi, California, the terrified Irma Fayette is killed when her father's .45 from the attic explodes in her hand. In Nyack, New York, George McDougal suffers a heart attack while jogging, running, and trying not to think of his dead family. I think he dies happily. In Clewiston, Florida, Ellen Drummond drinks a bottle of creme de menthe to forget her sorrows and falls asleep, with a cigarette in her hand, burning down her house, and most of the town with it. Arthur Stimson of Reno, Nevada, steps on a rusty nail and dies of shock and blood loss after trying to amputate his gangrenous foot. In Swanville, Maine, 10-year-old Candace Moran falls off her bike and dies of a fractured skull. Milton Kraslow in Hardin County, New Mexico is bitten by a rattlesnake and dies half an hour later. In Milltown, Kentucky, Judy Horton accidentally locks herself in a walk-in freezer and starves to death. In Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Jim Lee, presumably not that Jim Lee, hooks his house up to a gasoline generator and then electrocutes himself starting it up. And finally, Richard Hoggins of Detroit, Michigan, ODs on heroin that hits him like a freight train. I bet he died pretty happy as well. These were all probably preventable deaths, but there's no one left to prevent him. The man in charge is gone. At least until our loners and drifters get together, which, you just know that they will, as my sociologist stand-in Glenn Bateman says toward the end of book 1. Man is a gregarious social animal, and eventually we'll get back together, if only so we can tell each other stories about how we survived the Great Plague of 1990. Sort of feels like what I've been doing since coming back to the office, but it's something that won't truly start in the stand until book 2, On the Border, which we'll discuss next time, because this has been the Drunk on Writing dissection of The Stand, Book 1, Captain Trips. And before we wrap, I want to say, I really wish this book could have served as a warning. After all, it was initially published in 1978, more than 30 years before COVID, and it was re-released in its uncut form in 1990, well after the AIDS epidemic. But The Stand's subject matter was still looked at with some skepticism. As Robert Keeley pointed out in his New York Times review of the complete and uncut edition, what in 1978 might have looked like a fantastic exaggeration, in 1990 still appears a statistically exaggeration, but, sadly, not so fantastic. So, since 1978, since 1990, have we learned anything? Have we put any practices in place to ensure this couldn't happen? Well, I think we all probably know the answer to that by now, but it's probably actually worse than you think it is. On October 18th, 2019, for instance, just a few short weeks before COVID turned up, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security hosted Event 201. Described as a high-level pandemic exercise, according to a Johns Hopkins write-up afterwards, Event 201 dropped participants right in the midst of an uncontrolled coronavirus outbreak that was spreading like wildfire out of South America to wreak worldwide havoc. In the simulation, which Johns Hopkins had to state did not predict COVID-19, sure it didn't, I believe you. The outbreak resulted in the death of 65 million people within 18 months because we were that unprepared to stop it, that unprepared to address it, to contain it, and to respond to it. Anyway, I wonder what fun book 2 will bring. I don't remember liking it very much the last time that I read it, but perhaps that's changed. We'll find out soon in the very next dissection addendum. But for now, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and loved ones, and anyone you see wearing a How's Your Pork button on their jacket. And head on over to drunkonwriting.com to support the channel and get yourself some exclusive benefits. Until next time, cheers. Keep on